Of all the methods of murder, poisonings can be particularly hard to solve. There's usually a delay between the criminal act itself and the result of it, by which time the poisoner has had an opportunity to remove himself or herself from the scene and from potential suspicion. And sometimes, if the poison is even detected, that's the only evidence there is. Now, in the spring of 1988, 41-year-old Peggy Carr had moved to Alturas to live with her new husband, Pi Carr. Now, Peggy's marriage to Pi was a marriage that, although very new, was already coming up against its fair share of problems. After only 5 months of marriage, Peggy discovered that Pi was having an affair. And all of this was just too much for Peggy. So she packed a few bags and moved out of the house with her children and grandchildren. The very next day, she returned home and the new couple reconciled. Early one Saturday morning, not long after, Peggy slipped into her work clothes and drove to the restaurant an hour early. Now, Floyd was a regular at the Nicholas Diner, and over time, he and Peggy developed a close bond. Floyd was a retired mechanist, but for Peggy, he was kind of like her psychiatrist, or at least that's how she jokingly referred to him. Peggy told him about Pi's infidelity and about the problems with the kids. Now, Floyd listened to Peggy, being his usual supportive self, but then sometime during the conversation, Peggy suddenly froze, and her face darkened with worry. She clutched her chest, looked at Floyd, and told him, "Floyd, I think I'm having a heart attack." Now, Floyd had been a medic back in his Army days and had retained his knowledge and training, so he knew what to look for. There was no indication that Peggy was having a heart attack like she suspected. Now, Floyd continued to reassure her that her vitals and coloration were fine. It must all be in her mind, he said, psychosomatic. So once the clock struck 7 and Peggy's morning shift officially began, she slid into her smock and began work. Early that afternoon, her daughter Sissy arrived at the restaurant. "Why don't you just go home and take it easy," Sissy said, sounding concerned. "Casey can lay down and nap with you." So Peggy left, picked up Casey, and returned home to the house she shared with Pi. And then, when Pi finally came home, he found his wife lying on the couch, drained of vitality, barely able to greet him. But rather than calling a doctor, he called up his sister, Carolyn. Carolyn happened to be a nurse. So by the time that Carolyn showed up with her blood pressure monitor only a short time later, Peggy's condition had worsened to a point where she was seriously thinking about going to the emergency room. Meanwhile, Pi was in the kitchen drinking a cocktail. "Are you going to take her to the hospital?" Peggy's daughter asked him. So Pi loaded his wife up into his pickup and drove her to the nearest hospital. Now, Sissy, her daughter, followed close behind with her daughter Casey in the car seat, and when they got there, Peggy was taken into the examining room. None of the tests performed revealed anything abnormal. 3 days after she was first admitted, the clouds began to part. It seemed like Peggy Carr was on the road to recovery, and then she was back at home with Pi. It was after this, the next morning, that Peggy woke up, but just barely. Her illness had returned, but this time, she wasn't the only one in the house feeling sick. Her son Dwayne and even Pi's son Travis both came down with similar symptoms. Sissy was working her shift at the Nicholas family restaurant. While there, she talked to her and her mother's coworker Rita about what was going down at the house, and she was beginning to suspect that Pi and his sister Carolyn were poisoning her mother. But Rita, her coworker, was skeptical. But then, the more she thought about it, the more it seemed actually quite plausible. As Sissy's shift was almost over, the phone rang at the restaurant. Sissy answered, and it was Pi. "Your mother's in an ambulance," he told her, heading back to the hospital. Once she was admitted again, Peggy was examined by the resident neurologist, Dr. Richard Holster. And when Pi Carr revealed to Dr. Holster that his son and stepson were also coming down with symptoms much like Peggy's, the doctor began to suspect some kind of poison might be behind it all. "I think it's thallium," he said. His colleague expressed skepticism. "That seems highly unlikely, no?" He also couldn't think of anything else that would fit so neatly into Peggy's systems. So they took a sample of Peggy's urine and they sent it away for analysis. Peggy had so much thallium in her system, 50 times the maximum safe amount for human exposure, that it seemed almost certain she would die. So at this point, Dr. Holster confided in his colleague that he believed his patient, Peggy, had been intentionally poisoned. It would appear, the doctor told him, that someone tried to poison your entire family. So back at the Carr property, county health inspectors and investigators began combing through everything inside of the Carr house and around it. And then there was the threatening letter mailed to the Carr residence 4 months earlier. Quote, "You and all of your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida or else you all die. This is no joke." Interestingly, there was nuance in the formatting of the address that suggested that it was someone local, someone close by who likely had sent it. So the family reflected back on that chicken dinner that they'd eaten the day after Peggy was first released from the hospital, shortly before everyone started getting sick. Tammy, who tested negative for thallium, recalled having eaten the same food as everyone else. The only difference was Tammy only drank Diet Cola, and she had cracked open a canned Diet Pepsi while everyone else enjoyed the Coca-Cola from glass bottles out of the 8-pack, the remainder of which was being stored beneath the kitchen sink. Who bought the glass bottles? Detective Mincy asked, but no one in the family could remember. They usually bought Pepsi, and it was unlikely anyone in the house would have bought Coca-Cola now that they really pressed to think about it. It seemed as though the 6-pack of Coke had just shown up. And then there were the only other people in close proximity to the Carr household, the Carr's next door neighbors. The Carr's next door, the only neighbors, George Trepal and his wife, Dr. Diana Carr, which again, same spelling but no relation to the Carr family. So Detective Mincy learned that there had been conflict between the next door couple and the Carr household dating back quite some time. And most recently, only a day or two before Peggy's symptoms first appeared, there had been an ugly altercation between Peggy and Dr. Diana. So to Detective Mincy, when he heard about this, it sounded like your typical neighbor squabbles. Insufficient motive to commit murder, but nevertheless, he felt it important to interview the couple anyway. Due diligence. Now, finally, one afternoon, the detective located Dr. Diana at her office. She downplayed the altercation with Peggy, suggesting it was just your average spat between neighbors, which is pretty much what Detective Mincy had assumed in the first place. If anything was curious to him, it was Diana's strangely upbeat demeanor when talking about her neighbors being poisoned. But nothing else really raised any red flags to him. At this point, there were so many possibilities. On December 2nd, the phone rang at Detective Mincy's office. It was the head chemist at the Florida State Crime Lab. They'd discovered the source of the thallium. It was the empty Coca-Cola bottles. In a thin, sludgy film left behind at the bottom of each bottle, they detected substantial quantities of thallium. So whoever was responsible obviously planted the Coca-Cola bottles inside the home. So the culprit would likely be someone well aware of the family's schedule and their comings and goings. The FBI suggested to Polk County detectives that they begin interviewing neighbors. And of course, Detective Mincy had already done that. He'd already interviewed the Carr family's only neighbors, or at least one of them, Dr. Diana, but he'd yet to talk to the woman's husband, George Trepal. Mincy and his new partner on the case, Detective Brad Breck, stopped by the property, and when they arrived, they saw Trepal standing in his driveway. They showed the man their badges, and the man invited them inside the house. When asked what he did for a living, Trepal told them he programmed computers and wrote freelance articles for computer magazines. When talking about his neighbors, Trepal initially didn't have much to say. They're not really our kind of people. Have you had any problems with them? Detective Mincy asked. That's when something seemingly took over George, like he was possessed, and he began rattling off a long laundry list of complaints about the Carr family dating back years. So on their drive back to the station, Breck turned to Mincy and said very simply, "I think he did it. Now let's prove it." And the case had now become a homicide. Peggy Carr was dead at 41 years of age. The prime suspect at this point was neighbor George Trepal. It had been nearly a year since Peggy Carr's death, and as the detectives from Polk County searched the house, bagging and tagging everything of potential interest, they found a secret passageway, which led to a creepy hidden room with all sorts of bondage equipment and a mannequin. It appeared to be some kind of torture chamber. Multiple books on poisons were also found inside the house. And in the workshop of the home, detectives discovered several small bottles, and one of them, containing a white substance, was sent away to the lab, where it tested positive for the same kind of thallium as that which was used in the Coca-Cola that poisoned the Carr's family. With sufficient evidence to constitute probable cause, George Trappau was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Peggy Carr. Diana would later be charged with battery on a law enforcement officer for her outburst when police arrived to search the house. And on February 5th, 1991, he was sentenced to death.